Professor Chomsky, you mentioned the Latin American Studies Association and their involvement in the academy. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, the Latin American Studies Association.
Say again.
I was wondering if you could go back to what you were going to say about the Latin American Studies Association.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting case. As I mentioned, the professional societies just fell into line almost totally. I mean, I sort of semi-quoted John King Fairbank, way out at the distant extreme. Now that's very useful. Whenever the government is carrying out some crime, domestic or international, it's extremely useful for the media, especially the liberal media, to be able to go to the local university and get a liberal expert who will give them the party line with all the, and then they can be objective. They say, well, look how objective, here's what liberal critical scholarship says, and you got the party line in the newspapers. That's happened almost universally. There was one interesting exception, very dramatic, in the 1980s with the Latin American Studies Association. That's the mainstream association. It's not the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars. That's the main professional association. Not particularly activist, a lot of conservatives, but they cared about the countries where they were working in, and they wouldn't toe the line. You couldn't go to the local university and get someone to present the party line. That's quite interesting what happened. If you look back at the 80s, they rarely called upon the media and the left journals, liberal journals like, say, the New York Review. They didn't call upon the standard experts. They had to invent a new cadre of experts who would toe the party line. People like Robert Lakin, others, who were invented. And the inventions were quite interesting. Like Robert Lakin, who wrote for the New York Review, happens to be somebody I knew. He's a Maoist. He got involved in the anti-war movement around 1970, very late, but he kind of was involved. Quickly went off to the fringes, which were then developing. He became an active Maoist. He went to Mexico. He claimed he was working with guerrillas. People used to send him a little money to help him out. But he suddenly recognized at some point that Maoism and Reaganism are virtually identical. They both have the same enemy, what was called hegemonism in Maoist doctrine, meaning the Russians. So he began to write things about how the sturdy peasants of Nicaragua are rising up against the hegemonists and so on, meaning the Contras, the US-backed Contras, are attacking the Sandinistas. And the stuff he was writing was absolutely comical. It was straight out of Maoist texts, but it sold. He started testifying before Congress. He started writing the New York Review. He became one of the great experts. Kind of a Maoist version of Reaganism. And there were a couple of others like him, but they could not draw on the Latin American Studies Association in the normal way. And it stayed like that. I mean, for example, there was an election in 1984, which was not supposed to take place because the U.S. was opposed to it. Didn't want an election. This is a dictatorship. They're not allowed to have an election. Well, there was an election. It was very carefully monitored, probably the most monitored election in history at that point, by a British parliamentary inquiry and all sorts of others, hostile governments. And in fact, the Latin American Studies Association sent a range of specialists who did field work in Nicaragua. And they were there for a couple of weeks, and they wrote a long report about the election. And they said, there were flaws, but by regional standards, pretty fair election. That couldn't be mentioned, because that election didn't take place. In fact, there was an interesting technique to try to kill it. The administration, the Reagan administration, right on the eve of the election, announced that Russia was sending MiGs to Nicaragua. So no talk about the election, just the Russian MiGs. If you look at anybody with eyes open knew that this is a total fabrication. Actually, Nicaragua had it reason to get MiGs. The CIA was controlling its airspace and directing the guerrillas by, telling them where the Sandinista army was so they could attack what were called soft targets. It's pretty frank. So they had a good reason for it, but they knew better to do it. They knew if they got one pistol there, U.S. will go berserk. So they didn't do it. It was obvious it was an invention, but it was the headlines enough to suppress the election, and then a couple of weeks later it was exposed, but then it was all over. What was interesting to see was the reaction of the liberals, like Senator Dodd or Senator Tsongas, the congressional liberals. They said, well, we're not convinced that this is really true, but if it is true, we're going to have to really wipe out Nicaragua. We can't allow them to be a danger to us, and to be a huge danger if they had MiGs. You might remember that in 1985, a year later, without anybody laughing, Ronald Reagan strapped on his cowboy boots and declared a national emergency because of the threat to the security of the United States posed by the government of Nicaragua, which had troops only 2 days from Texas. We're about to be overwhelmed. It was almost as bad as when Grenada was about to be overwhelmed. Well, that was the mood in the 80s, and it's across the spectrum. But Lasso wouldn't go along. In fact, their report on the election was just suppressed, just as their spokespersons were not entirely, but more or less. They weren't the resource that the media went to, as they usually can. That's a good illustration of how the Academy doesn't have to cave in. It can or wants to, but it doesn't have to. What usually happens, in my view, during these periods of repression is that the Academy stays at the norm, but the fringes that it tolerates tend to be cut off. And that's the political firings and so on. But the norm doesn't seem to be to change very much. And it has to do with the commitments of the intellectual culture to power and authority. Not unique to the United States, it's almost a historical universal.